Hello everyone, this is Taliesin McKnight, and this is part 2. In our last video, we talked about the creation of the cosmos by the process of emanation. This is the gradual unfoldment and revelation of God. According to emanationism, if God is truly infinite, then creation could not happen outside of God. If God is boundless and there are no limits, then creation cannot happen outside of the deity. Creation has to happen within the Godhead. So according to the doctrines of the Kabbalah, creation, it bridges the gap between the unknowable absolute and the material world of limitation by the gradual process of unfoldment, the gradual process of concealment or limitation or restriction of the light, the divine light. And so we saw that creation, there is not simply this duality, here's God, here's creation, bam. In the Kabbalah, there is a gradual, systematic process to manifestation. There is a systematic process to creation. And we saw that matter is simply condensed energy, condensed divine energy. And in the Kabbalah, there is not this contrary opposites of good and evil. We also looked at a Kabbalistic doctrine of good and evil. That good and evil are not two opposing forces like light and darkness. That the origin of evil, the klipot, the shells, is the gradual restriction, the gradual concealment until you get to the physical world, which in Malkut exists the klipot. So that it is rather a removal, it is rather being somewhat removed from the source of goodness and light. Now you'll immediately notice some similarities with Platonism and some forms of Greek philosophy here. Now actually, the Kabbalistic ideas are not really new or novel per se. These concepts are found within different systems of philosophy, mysticism, and religion. So these ideas are not new. However, these ideas are painted, colored from a Jewish perspective. But anyways, I'm getting off topic. I do want to go into this, but going back to what I said, creation is the gradual condensation of energy. And now we have vice, we have virtue, we have good and evil. We have all of these things, which you could say that partaking of the knowledge of good and evil was the fall into Malkut, because that's where the dualities exist. So that Malkut could be seen as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It could be seen as this restriction. Another view is that good and evil could be seen as the introduction of the concept of polarity. Now, as I said, these concepts are found in different systems, but it's painted with from a Jewish perspective. What do I mean by this? If you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life within the world of Asiya, you'll see what looks very much like the Aristotelian cosmos, the cosmos of Aristotle. You'll see the prima mobile, which is Keter. You'll see the zodiac. Within that ring is Saturn. Within that is Jupiter. Within that is Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and Earth. Malkut. which is surrounded by the moon. This looks just like Aristotle's map of the cosmos. So you'll find some very similar ideas that you find in Platonism, that you find in Neoplatonism. Now, I am not here saying that this is just some Hellenized form of Judaism. That's not what I'm saying. But for the sake of comparative religion, we will see that these ideas were going around the Mediterranean. These ideas were found in the Greek world. These were found in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, how the hell could you how could you unite a Judaism and a Hellenized Greek philosophy? Just look at Philo-Judaeus, and this is also interesting for looking at Christianity. Philo-Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria, lived within the Hellenized world of Alexandria. He was born in the 1st century BCE, and he died in the 1st century of our Common Era. So he lived before and during the birth of Christ, supposedly. Now, Philo-Judaeus had reconciled Greek philosophy and Judaism. In fact, he had the same problem as the Kabbalah. How do you reconcile the absolute and the physical world? He solved this by the Logos, the Word. Philo-Judaeus said that the Word, the Logos, was the creative instrument of the Godhead. It was the intermediary between man and God. He even explicitly called the Word, the Logos, the Son of God. So that's interesting that before Christianity and during its uprising, there was a Hellenized Jew in Egypt talking about the Word as the Son of God. So that's interesting. And, Paul of Tarsus largely developed Christian doctrine. And he grew up in Tarsus, which was a center of some forms of Greek philosophy. So you may wonder, did the early Christians borrow from Hellenistic ideas? Now we're getting way off topic. The point is that these concepts are found within different systems, but it is painted. It is painted by the experience of Judaism. Now Judaism and Christianity are very different. They are as different as they are similar. Christianity has the concept of sin and salvation. Judaism has no concept of this. In fact, in the 15th century, at the dawn of the 16th century, with the exiling of the Jews from Spain, with the Edict of Expulsion by Ferdinand and Isabella, a lot of the Jews were forced to convert to Christianity, and when they came back to Judaism, they talked about getting saved by the Torah, which has no concept. Judaism has the idea of exile and return. Now, you see this a lot. Now, there is a point to what I'm saying. I am leading up to something. Exile and return. We see this constantly. Adam was exiled from paradise. You see the constant theme of exile and return within the Bible. With the conquest of the Assyrians, with the conquest of the Babylonians and the destruction of the temple in the 6th century BC, the Jews were exiled into Babylon. Then they returned. And of course, with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD, there was the great diaspora, the exile. Exile was a constant theme within Judaism. So you would expect that the concept of exile and return would be a central concept in the Kabbalah. Now, where does the Kabbalah come from? We do have some early texts, such as the Sefer Yetzirah. We do have some mystical ideas found within the Talmud, within the Mishnah and the Gemara. But the Zohar does not appear until the end of the 13th century with Moses de Leon. So the Kabbalah as we know it today, we cannot say for a fact that it existed as the system we know today before the ending of the 13th century. So people that say, oh, the Kabbalah goes back to ancient Egypt, there's no evidence for that. The Zohar popped up at the end of the 13th century. There was a further development in the 16th century by Isaac Luria and Moses Cordovero. The Kabbalah further developed later on. And today we have the Hasidic movement in the 19th century. So the Kabbalah is not something that is unchanged from Egypt. It is something that developed, as we know, as we can trace it, at the end of the Middle Ages to the form that we have today. Now, I don't want to burst any bubbles. Now, I'm getting way off topic here. Exile and return. This is the basis of the Kabbalah. We are exiled from our source, and we have to return to our source. There is no concept of salvation in the Kabbalah. It is not the theme of redemption and salvation. In fact, that is a foreign concept to the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah has the theme of exile and return. We were forced out of the Holy Land, and we must return to Israel. You'll notice that the Parshayot in the synagogue and the shul follow the Pentateuch, the Torah, and it's nothing but getting to the Promised Land. Now I do understand that there are other forms of Kabbalah that are just hermetic and occult and have nothing to do with Judaism. That's true, but your hermetic occult Kabbalah largely developed at the end of the 19th century. So, a lot of the people that developed the occult, popular Hermetic Kabbalah with a Q did not really understand the Kabbalah. So if you really want to understand the Kabbalah, you need to understand its roots. It's perfectly fine to go into Hermeticism and alchemy and all this stuff. That's great. But in some forms it is watered down. Now we're getting way off topic, but this was important. In fact, I think I'm going to do 3 videos. Exile and return. And today we've covered a little bit of the history of the Kabbalah, a slight amount, and compared it to different systems. Exile and return. We have been somewhat removed from the source. Now God is immanent. It exists within us. In fact, we are an aspect. We are a part of the divine. Nothing can exist outside of God. Just the same, we have been exiled into matter, the exile from the garden. We have to return to reclaim our lost estate. Now, how do we do this? We have to return to our source. Jacob had a dream. He saw a ladder from earth to heaven, and angels going up and descending. This is Jacob's ladder. These are the 7 rungs of the ladder. Returning to the source has to do with the reconciliation of opposing forces. First of all, we need to unite the opposing aspects of our being. You'll notice that Keter on the tree of life, even though it's on the point of equilibrium, the pillar of mildness, the middle pillar, it is above the 2 pillars. It is above Chokmah and Binah. It transcends duality. The Zohar, the Book of Splendor, which, as I said, popped up at the end of the 13th century. The Zohar speaks in sexual symbolism constantly. Male and female aspects to deity, male and female aspects with ourselves. So part of the return has to do with the middle pillar. You'll notice if you add up the numbers of the Sephirot on the middle pillar, it equals 26, which also equals Tetragrammaton, the middle pillar. The path of return is reconciling opposites, which is part of fixing the vessels. Union of opposites. This has to do with balance and uniting the opposing aspects within ourselves. This is attaining wholeness. This is not placing the self into conflict with the self. The way to return is the reconciliation of opposing forces. And also what I like to call the equivalence of form. Now, what is the equivalence of form? The equivalence of form is, in the physical world, closeness and distance is a physical thing. It's a mechanical closeness or distance. This is close, this is distant. But in a realm without time or space, in the spiritual world without space, how do you have closeness and distance? How do you have closeness and distance from God? Which really God's everywhere, you know what I mean, to the source. In the spiritual world, it is similarity and difference. For example, I like comedy. I like a lot of really warped comedies. Hangover, The Hangover 3, just saw that in the movies, it was hilarious. Grown Ups, Adam Sandler, I love comedy. Even though I talk about all this deep stuff, my personality is not like I appear on camera. I talk about all this deep stuff, but in my own personality, I'm like, grown ups, and I'm kind of eccentric, so it's hard to know my personality on camera, because all I do is talk about a bunch of history and stuff. Anyway, getting off topic. I love comedy. Someone can be right next to me, and they hate comedy. Even though we're physically close to each other, spiritually, you could say we are worlds apart. The equivalence of form is to develop the divine attributes, and as you develop these higher aspects of ourselves, we gradually ascend the tree, and this is the raising of our consciousness, reconciling opposites and going up. Now we're running out of time. I went way off into some other stuff, but it was important, y'all. And in my next video, I'll talk about macroprosopis and the vast countenance and the lesser countenance, which are an important part of the Zohar. And we'll look at the Zohar and what it has to say. Thank you for joining me, and this is part 2.